Taylor believes that critics of modernity have missed something extremely important. They have failed to see that modern aspirations to self-expression and self-fulfillment are moral aspirations. In the opening lecture of this series, Taylor identified Alan Bloom's recent bestseller, The Closing of the American Mind, as typical of this mistake. Bloom, according to Taylor, treats the moral relativism and political indifference of contemporary youth as failures of moral character. Taylor, on the other hand, wants to treat these things as failures to live up to a moral ideal, which is actually implicit in modern individualism. He calls this ideal the ethic of authenticity, and in these lectures he has attempted to reveal both its grandeur and its moral stringency. Tonight, Charles Taylor concludes his presentation.
I've been trying to make a plea in the last 4 talks for a different stance towards the ethic of authenticity, towards modern individualism, and trying to induce us to look at these not simply as ineluctable slide toward disaster, but as complex moral developments which are open to, vulnerable to, very deviant and dangerous forms, but that come out of a depth of moral understanding which, properly understood, can redirect them and put them back on the track. So I've been pleading here, if you like, for a work of retrieval, reaching back and trying to discover the sources in order to change our practice, bring our practice back to the highest aspirations of these moral views. But at the end of the first lecture, I allowed that this whole approach is based on certain assumptions which might not be granted. Let me remind you of them now. There were 3. The first was that the ethical view underlying these modern developments, what we've now talked of as the ethic of authenticity, for instance, really does represent something good and admirable. The second assumption was that discovering what is good and admirable in it can make a difference, because you can reason with people and convince them that this more admirable view of it ought to be adopted. And the third assumption was that if you could convince people, they can do something about it because they aren't totally locked into a certain direction that modern society imprints on them, that they aren't caught in what Weber called an iron cage, that if we all come to see things differently, we can actually change the course of our history and our society. All 3 of these have been challenged. Now, in a sense, I hope that I've, anyway, partly answered by implication objections against the first 2 assumptions, though I recognize that the arguments are very incomplete. For those who might think that the ethic of authenticity isn't actually all that impressive a moral view, I hope that simply the rather sketchy attempts I've made to describe the kinds of aspirations and the view of human beings that's behind it will have partly convinced them to change their mind. If it hasn't, if they still don't think it's all that impressive, I don't know what else I could say here except to go over the same ground again, perhaps in greater detail, perhaps more vividly, except I would like just to throw in one ad hominem remark, that I think that whatever we officially believe about it, whatever we tell ourselves we believe about this ethic, we actually are all very deeply embedded in it. And that even those who, in our culture, who claim to condemn it and find it contemptible and find it uninteresting and shallow, one very often finds with them as well that when they are making certain decisions in their lives, choosing their life partner or choosing their career, that they begin to talk in their own deliberation in terms which resonate with the notions of self-fulfillment, of having a fulfilled life, and so on. So strongly is this ethic embedded in our culture that even those who seem to be rebelling against it are very often living it. That is, as you like, an ad hominem argument, perhaps not an entirely fair one, but I think one which forces us to take this very seriously. Against the second assumption, that is, if someone thinks that argument makes no difference, well, I also hope, perhaps a little bit presumptuously, but I hope that the arguments I've been putting forward, or perhaps I should rather say the argument sketches, the hints of argument that I've been putting forward in these talks, might also help to convince them of the opposite, that there is some way we can reason about these things and in reasoning convince people. So I'll take the first two assumptions, if not as proven, at least as sufficiently defended, to be able to leave them alone or take them for granted. But how about the third assumption? The third assumption is that we can do something about it, and what challenges that is the view of our fate as people living in an iron cage. That is the view of our society and civilization as having so determined our way of understanding ourselves, our way of acting, that we, in fact, are left with no choice. And many people have given this kind of picture of technological society, or alternatively, looking at it from another angle, of capitalist society. One sees, of course, in Marx himself this kind of picture of capitalist society, where whatever the intentions of the actors, they are all forced by the competitive situation in which they find themselves ineluctably to move towards greater and greater capitalization, a greater and greater suppression of working standards of the working people, and hence, in Marx's picture, a growing crisis. But without having to pick up on Marx's exact version, there are lots of people today who think that we are similarly driven ineluctably by the very nature of our society in certain directions. In the directions, for instance, of perpetual growth, in the directions of perpetual pressure on the limits of tolerance of our environment, constantly endangering it, in the direction of perpetual concentration of populations in larger and larger, more and more unwieldy centers, in the direction of greater and greater bureaucratic control and bureaucratic constructions centralizing control over vast areas of life. And therefore, as a result of all this, of course, in the direction of greater and greater instrumental rational direction of our lives. We've all seen pictures of this kind, and they do pick up on something very, very central in modern society. I don't mean in any way, for a single moment, to underestimate these theories or these views. They are definitely onto something very important about modern life. I suppose you could sum it up by saying that in a modern society, as against earlier modes of society, a great deal of the way in which our different actions are all coordinated and become compatible together as we exist in society, a great deal of this coordination is carried by what one might call invisible hand processes. That is, processes which are not either planned or decided by anyone, nor determined by purely traditional norms, but simply emerge out of the structures that we've come to live in as they operate impersonally around us. The paradigm example of this, of course, is coordination of economic activities through a market. We've seen with the demise of communist societies in the East the end of the last great attempt in a modern industrial society to coordinate economic activity some other way by central planning, in other words, by decision, by the decision of those who operate the central plan. And of course, the very nature of a modern society, having broken free of traditional modes of action, means that economic activity, the activity of different economic agents, is not coordinated simply by traditional norms. We've gone way beyond the period in the Middle Ages where the kinds of clothes one wore and the kind of pattern of consumption one engaged in was determined by one's position in a society of orders, and therefore where the way in which different economic agents fitted together anyway in that respect was determined by traditional norms. How we coordinate in a modern industrial society, in a modern industrial capitalist society, is by no conscious, to a great degree, without conscious coordination at all, by mechanisms like the market, which bring about a pattern of coordination, in a certain sense behind the backs of, without calling on the decisions of, the various people coordinated. Adam Smith, of course, used his famous expression, the invisible hand, for this kind of coordination through the market. And that's what I'm referring to in general by this term of invisible hand mechanisms. In a sense, we could argue that there are two big types of these in modern society, those concerned with markets on one hand, and those which arise out of bureaucratic methods of organization on the other. Now, the existence of these invisible hand modes of coordination is something which, at one level, has been shown, particularly with the demise of communism, to be indispensable for a modern society. We couldn't do without these to some degree, but it's also been seen naturally as very threatening. And if one believes that one of the directions that these invisible hand mechanisms push us in is, for instance, towards ever greater growth, or towards ever greater concentration, or towards ever greater bureaucracy, then one will indeed fear that maybe we can't do anything about it. Maybe we can discover, yes, that certain forms of modern society tend to drive us towards the trivialized end of the spectrum in our ethic of authenticity. But alas, those forms are, as it were, written into the very structure of our invisible hand mechanisms, and we can't do anything about them. That's a very, very tempting view. And people who hold that view are tempted just to throw up their hands and say, nothing can be done. Now, I want to say to this kind of view, that it has a lot of truth to it, that it certainly is true that coordination through markets does tend to entrench individualistic modes of conceiving my life and so on. It does tend to give a premium to instrumental efficacy, to the application of instrumental reason as I try to calculate the best manner of surviving in this market environment. It does tend to put a premium on growth and so on. I think that a great many of these theories which pinpoint the directions that we're pushed in by these mechanisms are right. But the really important question we have to ask ourselves is, while these mechanisms certainly reduce our degrees of freedom, certainly make it impossible to do anything we want, do they reduce our degrees of freedom to zero? Do they make all effort in this field impossible? And this seems to me to be just wrong. Let's try to look at bits of recent history in order to see why this is so. Let's take as our example from the area of the second major concern that I mentioned in the first lecture, the runaway control over our lives of instrumental reason. I've been talking in the last three talks almost exclusively about the first main area of worry, the worry about modern individualism. Let's give a little bit of run now to the second one, the concern about galloping instrumental reason. Well, one of the areas in which this concern is most evident, of course, is the area where we feel ourselves pushed towards pressing the limits of tolerance of our natural environment, constantly on the brink of destroying the environment that we have to live in. And the sense that we may be ineluctably locked into a pattern where we're driven in this direction is very frightening. We can see all sorts of examples. I mean, the recent discovery of an even faster thinning of the ozone layer than we thought before means that the decisions painfully arrived at to phase out certain chemicals by, I think, the year 2000 must now be revised, and revised in an even more urgent direction to phase them out even quicker. And we think of the immense difficulties we have in coming to these decisions, the thought that we might be driven by our whole economic way of life to threaten in all sorts of directions the limits of tolerance of our existence in the world is a very worrying thought. But let's just look at exactly this same type of issue, the issue of environmental responsibility, and look at it from another angle. Think of the way in which the development of our society in the past has savaged all sorts of natural environments, wilderness environments, with very often total lack of concern. And think of how in the past various small groups living in these environments or close to these environments have tried to fight for their preservation, for their defense, and have been more or less mowed down by the great juggernaut of progress. And we can think of the almost inevitable defeat of those rearguard actions in the past as the product of another kind of invisible hand process. The process of, if you like, political will formation in a modern democratic society. What happens when people understand themselves in general as being in the business of increasing production, increasing prosperity, raising GNP, and then particular groups in small localities discover that the way we're doing this involves destroying a whole forest to feed a very rapacious lumber industry, or destroying a wilderness area, and they react against that and want it stopped. But in the reigning climate of understanding of what politics is about, what legitimacy do they have, what hope can they have of stopping it? Because it looks as though the issue is the interest and concern of a small minority group on one hand against the general prosperity of the population as a whole on the other. As long as the issue is encoded in these terms, the small group defending the wilderness area is bound to lose. As a matter of fact, they're even bound to look as though they ought to lose, because they just are a small minority with their own particular attachment to some area against the welfare of the majority. And so we have the kind of battle that's, for instance, been going on in certain areas of Canada and in British Columbia concerning the logging of certain areas, where it's very often been presented in the past as a small minority of either local residents or what are called disparagingly tree huggers are standing in the way of progress, investment, prosperity for the majority of the society. That's the way it's been encoded. Encoded that way, you can see a virtual certainty that each one of these small battles will be a losing battle. But now, look what happens. Look what has happened to some degree when there comes to be a general understanding in the society as a whole that there is a real danger in the destruction of these wilderness areas for everyone, for our whole future, perhaps going beyond simply the notion of a danger to life and an understanding of how this is a danger perhaps to our very humanity. But for whatever the reasons, there comes to be a more broadly spread understanding of this. Immediately, quite different kinds of coalitions become possible. It becomes possible for the battle between those who want to savage the wilderness area and those who want to defend it no longer to be encoded as the interests of the majority and prosperity against the special interest of a small group, but rather here as the battle between two very fundamental philosophies of how the society as a whole should find its welfare in the modern world and in its environment. And encoded in that second way, we sometimes find that those who are on the side of ecological responsibility can win out, and that the defenders in the local area are now no longer just isolated group interested in their own particular interests, but are part of a majority spread across the whole society in many different milieux. What does this teach us? Well, it teaches us that the very conditions in which, if you like, the invisible hand mechanisms of the market and bureaucracy drive us can be, the very directions in which they drive us can be inflected very considerably depending on the condition of democratic will formation, if I can call it that, in the society. If the society is utterly insensitive to framing some kind of common mind and democratic will around issues like environmental protection, then the mechanism I described earlier will be in full force, and each small group will go down to defeat in its own local, isolated battle before the forces of mindless development. If, however, another kind of democratic consensus is emerging around the importance of environmental issues, then this won't necessarily be the outcome, and some real possibility of environmental protection will open out. This example, just in itself, shows very clearly, I think, that our degrees of freedom are not zero. The direction we're driven in is not ineluctable. It's not to say that we have grounds for tremendous optimism. It's not to say that anything is possible, that we can take any direction we want, we can make a 180-degree turn. That may not be on the cards. But it is possible to change the direction of things by the creation of new constellations of democratically chosen purposes. And that, I think, is sufficient to show that we, after all, are not inhabiting an iron cage. But when we come to this issue of technology and instrumental reason, some people think we're locked in to a certain path for another reason. Not so much only because of the social and political forms in which we live, but because of the very nature of technology itself. People feel that in a technological civilization, we are trained by the very nature of this mode of existence, a technological mode of existence, to treating the world around us as so much raw material, so much neutral stuff, which we can use to fulfill our purposes. If you like, technology itself is almost endowed with a certain direction implicit in it, a direction which pushes us more and more towards instrumental reason. This is another reason, there's another set of considerations which makes people feel that we're locked in, as well as their assessment of the invisible hand mechanisms. As a matter of fact, these two very often are interwoven in the discourse of people who feel that we're entirely locked in. And there's something in this too. There's no doubt that living in a technological civilization is living in a world in which the instrumental, rational approach to things comes very easily to us, is a very normal way of looking at things. We talk about a lot of the things in our world in terms of handling problems, in terms of means and ends, in terms of getting what we want, and so on. Even in matters which you think ought to be very far removed from the categories of instrumental reason in affairs of the heart or self-fulfillment and so on. So there's some truth in this view as well, and yet it is also crucially inadequate, crucially incomplete. And I think this is something that we have to look at more closely.
On Ideas Tonight, you're listening to the final broadcast in our week-long presentation of the 1991 Massey Lectures. This year's lecturer is Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor.
The simple view behind what I'm talking about is the view that technology, the technological project of modern civilization, is bound up with a stance of domination towards nature, controlling and dominating the world. That's what, if you like, that is the human stance or the human purpose, which, if I can put it this way, inframes our technological activity. To be engaged in technological activity is to be in this stance, in framing it by this set of purposes. I think that here we have, again, an example of the kind of thing I've been talking about in all the previous lectures. They are, of course, talking about it in connection with modern individualism, but here the same kind of thing emerges in relation to technology and instrumental reason. That is, the stance of domination, yes, in a sense, emerges out of technology, but yet doesn't emerge. That is, it isn't something which is built into a technological way of life as a logically inseparable part of it, but it is something which it tends to slide into in the kind of society that we live in, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier in connection with modern individualism. It's very important, therefore, to see that the first point, that a technological stance of domination doesn't emerge from technology ineluctably. It's very important to see, in other words, that there are other ways of morally inframing our technological existence, other ways of we're practicing the work of technological control and advancement within another kind of moral attitude and stance towards ourselves and the world. And in order to see that, we have to do the same kind of thing as I've been trying to do in earlier talks with the ethic of authenticity. We have to go back and retrieve certain of the moral sources which presided over the growth of technology. Okay, now there are two that I want to mention here among the many others that we could mention. One is a view, an understanding of ourselves as the kind of agents who can engage in technological progress and change. And this is a view of ourselves as possible agents and subjects of science and scientific progress. This view, which we find arising in the 17th century, is a view of ourselves as potentially disengaged reason. And this in turn is grounded on a moral ideal, the moral ideal of ourselves as, one might use this expression, self-responsible reasoners. That is, by self-responsibility I mean that we ourselves are checking and criticizing our own reasoning processes in order to make sure that they live up to certain standards. You might also put it, a view of ourselves as self-critical thinkers, self-critical reasoners, which is built into the very foundation of the modern scientific revolution. We find this kind of ideal articulated by great founding thinkers like Descartes and Locke. So here you have a certain embedding of the technological project, which has to do with an ideal of reason, an ideal of self-responsible knowledge. Of course, this ideal has been itself very badly misunderstood, been applied in a very dangerous and damaging way, wherever it's been understood not simply and not properly as an ideal that human beings aspire to, but as something like the very nature of human thinking itself. Because in the very nature of things, we as human beings can only stand in that disengaged stance to the world that science, natural science demands from us, with part of ourselves and part of the time. If we think of this stance as being our whole existence, then we'll denature and distort the way we live in the world, among human beings, in nature, and in the whole rest of our existence. But if we draw back from this attempt to make disengaged reason our whole existence and just think of it as an ideal, it is a very lofty and noble ideal. It's something which is, in a sense, one of the glories of modern civilization, that we've developed this standard of rigorous, well-reasoned, and self-critical knowledge and argument. Now, the stance, the development of technology, therefore, doesn't need to be understood simply within a stance of dominating the world. The drive for scientific progress and technological change doesn't need to be powered simply by the desire to control the world around us. It also has been in the past, and could again be in the future, partly powered by an ideal of understanding, of getting at the truth. You might say a properly philosophical ideal. That's another inframing of technology, which has been there from the beginning, can easily get relegated to the side, to the margins, particularly by the drive of big bureaucratic mechanisms and big industrial corporations who give another kind of impress to the development of technology. But it's nevertheless there in our civilization as something we can retrieve. There's a second important source, really quite different from the first one, that I want to mention, which is also very important. We forget too easily that at the origin of the development of technology, you might say the technological turn in modern European civilization, which I think you can in a way situate in the 17th century, the origin of that was a very important set of moral ideals about human welfare. As a matter of fact, this emerges very clearly in the writings of the 17th century thinker who is very often credited with or taken as the representative of this technological turn. I'm thinking of Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon's insistence that science should not be understood as it was among the Greeks, as an attempt simply to understand the world as a contemplatively pleasing order, but that rather our endeavor in science ought to be to discover ways in which we could change the world. As he put it, of what use is science if it cannot serve in some way to relieve the condition of mankind? Now this, if you like, technological stance, which Bacon builds into science itself as a criterion of its success, wasn't powered simply by a desire to dominate. It was much more than that. There was a sense of the importance of practical benevolence. It went along with a new value given, which we see in this whole period of European culture, a new value given to life, to the continuation of life, to, one might say, the ordinary life in which people make the means to life, live in families, have children, reproduce themselves. Tremendous value accorded to this and to producing the conditions to allow this to go on in plenitude and prosperity. So you have underlying the development of modern technology also this, you might say, philanthropic drive, not in the sense where people use this word to apply to charity, but in the sense, in the original meaning of the word, a sense of the value of human life. And that is also one of the inframing ideas that has underlain the development of technology and that could again. Now imagine what could happen if, instead of being inframed so predominantly by the desire to dominate, the development of technology were inframed by these other purposes to a much greater degree, by a love of knowledge and understanding on one hand, and by a sense of human welfare, real human welfare, on the other. Let's look at the second case particularly. Inframed by a sense of real human welfare, some of the dehumanizing results of technology could be checked by the very nature of this inframing. Runaway applications of the technological view which we sometimes see in the field of medicine, for instance, where the development of new cures, new research, new understanding of the mechanisms of the body can go along with the treatment of the patient as though he or she were simply the locus of certain of these processes, neglecting The patient is a whole person. The patient is a person with a history. The patient is a person with hopes and fears. The patient is a person who can dialogue with and understand along with the doctor what's happening to himself or herself. The relegation of all this to the boundaries, which can so easily happen with a runaway concentration on technology as control, you hear control over the disease, could be checked to the extent that this technological activity were understood and inframed in another kind of purpose, in another kind of sense of purpose, where the original Baconian sense of the welfare of the human being concerned was brought once more back to the fore. So we can see how even the picture of technology as ineluctably linked with domination has got to be challenged. Yes, it can easily tend to be that, and does tend to be that in our civilization, but it doesn't need to be that. And so in these two ways, we can see that we aren't, perhaps after all, locked in an iron cage. There are other ways of living a technological mode of life. There are other ways that are available in the very background, moral background, which has led to the development of technology. And unless we're totally locked in by the invisible hand mechanisms so that we're incapable of making good on those insights, we can perhaps inflect the direction of our civilization by retrieving these other moral enframings, these other moral sources, and by finding a way of changing the direction of our life in order to give fuller expression to these moral sources. Well, that is the political goal that lies before us. And so we come to the political dimension, perhaps all too late, of all these reflections. I just mentioned a minute ago, in trying to argue against the picture of us as being in an iron cage, driven by our invisible hand mechanisms, I just argued that a change in the way or the direction of our democratic will formation can actually change the direction that our society is carried in. And I tried to make this point with the example of ecological policy. And what one can draw from that is that an essential part of our being able to affect our fate in this regard is our being able to develop such wide-ranging modes of democratic will and consensus. We have to be able to form majority democratic will on these crucial issues. But there we run up against another of the great malaise of modernity, another of the great fears that people have put forward. The fear precisely that the growth of individualism, when it slides towards its more deviant forms, rampant instrumental reason, when it slides towards its most deviant form, the development out of both of these of large-scale bureaucratization, that all of these can produce a kind of falling away from democratic participation. The famous Tocquevillian fear that people will slip back into private life, will be enclosed in the solitude of their own hearts, and that as a result, the government of the society will run on in a way which is less and less responsible to them, less and less under their control. What we see here is a picture of a kind of fragmentation in which the formation of a broad-based democratic will is harder and harder to achieve. Tocqueville gives a quite frightening picture of this under his description of what he calls soft despotism, in which individuals go about their affairs less and less concerned with public life and politics, and as he calls it, a vast tutelary power rules over them, benignly giving them the welfare and the things that they want, but having control over their lives. Well, Tocqueville's nightmare of a soft despotism hasn't exactly happened in the form that he feared, and in particular in the United States, which was the society about which he was making this prediction. But you could argue that something almost as worrying from the point of view that I'm raising here has happened. What I mean by that is a kind of fragmentation. You see, the society that we see in the United States today is certainly not a Tocquevillian soft despotism. It's full of movement, energy, challenges, protestations, organization of campaigns of all kinds. It's a society in which the rulers are justifiably apprehensive about their popularity and about potentially losing this popularity in the public. It's not at all a docile society ruled by bureaucrats. But there is one danger and problem here. It's that in all this movement, one gets a channeling towards a certain kind of politics which makes the formation of majority democratic will harder and harder. That is, one gets a politics in which different groups become less and less capable of allying with others to form a majority of the population, and they have recourse more and more to a politics of protest and attack rather than a politics of majority creation and policy making. Let me try to explain this a little bit more. You can have a pattern of political life in a modern democracy where people feel a sense of hopelessness in joining together, backing a political party behind a program which is then to be carried out by legislation and made the law of the land. And in their despair at going this route and at making a success of this route, they turn to another route, the route of single-issue action in politics, mobilizing people in protest around their particular concerns, their particular narrow band of concerns, along with, very often, another political strategy, the strategy of judicial review, of intervening through the courts, through cases that are put forward in court, perhaps in the light of and in the framework of a charter of rights. And these two, single-issue politics and judicial action, of course, fit neatly together because they are always interventions that tackle particular issues at any one time. So people will make cases in court about the permissibility or impermissibility of abortion. And along with that, they will have single-issue campaigns mobilizing people pro-life or pro-choice. And their energies will go into these single channels of protest and demand in order to get their particular concerns, single concerns, agreed on to make them win out, regardless of the overall pattern of social life that results. This is a very different kind of thing from politics which is mainly concerned, where people are mainly concerned, to develop policies for the life of the whole society and to put them into effect by helping to create, be part of a majority coalition, which can in turn express itself through elected representatives and through legislation. And one can easily find that the more this single-track type of politics on single issues and judicial review becomes strengthened and entrenched, the more, of course, it fragments the potential base and constituency of a broad-based party, the more it renders this other kind of politics, the politics of formation of broad popular will, difficult and problematic. And then the more the broad formation of will is difficult and problematic, the more people are driven towards single-track politics. There is a danger then not of exactly of soft despotism in the Tocquevillian sense, but there is a danger in modern society, I think exemplified very much by the present situation on the American scene, of single-track politics. And what does that mean? What that means is certain issues, the issues that require the development of a broad conscious consensus on the part of the people, which requires, therefore, a sense among that majority of empowerment, that they can develop such a consensus and that it will have political effect. The issues that require that are issues that can't be properly handled. It's rather worrying, I think, looking at the present American scene, to see the imbalance that's been created in that society. Extremely successful single-issue campaigns, strikingly successful and spectacular turnovers occurring because of judicial decisions, but a political process which in some ways seems to be less and less capable of even approaching a semblance of rational debate between the parties that are vying for office, so that in some way through that debate a broad popular consensus can have some leverage and control on what is decided. It seems to me that if we're going to be able to inflect the direction of our civilization, are not going to be drawn along ineluctably by the invisible hand mechanisms in which we live, are not going to be sucked ineluctably into the directions that technology seems to slide into, inframed by domination. We have to be a society politically capable of generating majority democratic will. We have to be a society in which the politics of democratic will formation will always take precedence over single-track politics. And it seems to be the case that we in most modern democracies are in danger, once more, of sliding towards that kind of single-track politics. There are ways to combat that. As a matter of fact, when we go back to read the extraordinarily insightful words of Tocqueville, we find that these issues were already adumbrated. Ways that have to do with decentralization of power and the creation of and the sustenance of the instruments of democratic will formation, in particular a party system in which people in a broad base really participate. But this is the crucial concern that we have to have before us if we're going to realize the goals which arise from the kind of understanding we can achieve by a retrieval of our moral sources. It won't do us any concrete good if we make this return to the past, understand the richer moral sources of the ethic of authenticity and of our technological civilization, understand the way we slid away from them towards the facile and or trivialized or more dangerous modes of them, but are incapable of acting on that understanding to change the direction of our society. In order to do that, we have to be concerned with the health of our democratic polity in a way that we haven't been up to now. We have to be concerned not just to make sure that we remain, in some sense of the word, free societies, that there is the possibility of protest, of organization, of self-expression. We have to be concerned that the kind of politics of our society don't slide towards the fragmented single-track politics, which will make it difficult to get control over the direction of our whole society. And this is a third domain of worry, a third great domain of malaise, where once again, something of the same thing can be said about the other two, that it isn't written in the very stars or structure of our democratic tradition that it should slide in this direction, but where there's a perpetual danger that it do so. So, I've reached the end of these talks, and I've tried to range rather widely, range over three areas of concern and worry: individualism, instrumental reason, and politics. And I hope I've been able to make a little bit clearer why these three areas have to be dealt with together, the ways in which they are interlinked, the ways in which finding a solution to one requires finding a solution to the others. But I also hope I've made a bit more evident how closely analogous the three are, how in each case we find ourselves pressed with a certain worry and malaise about the development of our modern civilization. In each case, we perhaps are tempted to blame the very central developments into modernity themselves for these ills. But in each case, we find that in analyzing more closely what these developments have amounted to, we can see richer moral sources which actually give us choices about what direction to take these modern developments. The ethic of authenticity, instrumental reason and technology, and our democratic traditions. And in each of these cases, therefore, the work of retrieval is something which is not only intellectually important and challenging, but could be of tremendous significance for our future.